I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. A detail within Nauvoo Mormonism, Nauvoo Mormon history, I should say, which often escapes analysis and mention, and has only been mentioned in passing on this show for a few years now, is counterfeit money, bogus making. When Joe sought to establish his kingdom on the Mississippi, the Mormons were destitute, and he signed his name to dozens of land contracts with half a dozen land speculators in order to acquire the land for the Mormons to settle in Illinois and across the Mississippi in the Iowa Territory. However, the Mormons needed some liquid capital to work with, and therefore the Nauvoo House Association was conceived. The Nauvoo House was to be the premier hotel in Illinois, set to curry favor with powerful politicians and dignitaries upon their arrival to the city after landing on the wharf of the Mississippi. Established by the Nauvoo City Charter and a modern Doctrine and Covenants Section 124, the Nauvoo House was created with stocks to be purchased for $50 a share in order to raise capital for the project and create liquidity as a new form of money. The Nauvoo House was a massive resource vacuum and it never actually made any money, rendering the stock certificates printed for it essentially valueless within a few months of them being printed. That didn't stop the House Association from continuing to print and sell more stock certificates, but it did make people less willing to trade using them. The lack of capital problem needed to be solved in other ways. One of these was by creating the Temple Building Committee. Now, this building committee would take donations from Mormons, usually, sometimes money, but usually in goods. Then it would issue people who worked on the temple certificates for their work, which they could use to purchase goods from the Temple Committee store. Any donations that were made to the Temple Building Committee were recorded in the Book of the Law of the Lord, or the Balal, as we've called it on the show. This had the effect of raising capital, getting labor done on the temple at nearly no cost, and it also created a new form of money to exchange, those temple store certificates. Now, these are only a few of the systems to help create or to raise some money. Understandably, a lot of holes remained and money was always needed. To answer this, the Mormon leadership engaged in a practice many of them had dabbled in individually before Nauvoo, but never at a systematic citywide level: counterfeit money. Some of the hottest collector items among Mormon artifact collectors today are Nauvoo bogus coins, and bogus means counterfeit coins, physical coins. Now, in order to discuss this topic today, we're going to give a proper treatment to a figure in Mormon history who was constantly involved in counterfeit money. If there's a single figure in Nauvoo history which personifies counterfeit, it's Joseph H. Jackson. Now, we've already discussed Jackson quite a bit, including his meetings with Joseph Smith and his mission to break Porter Rockwell out of jail in Missouri. That's episodes 142 and 144 of the show. But I think we need a full episode dedicated to his story in order to kind of slot him into the larger timeline of Nauvoo and to kind of discuss the topic of bogus and counterfeit money. 19th century Illinois historian Thomas Gregg summarized Joseph Jackson's role in Mormon history as follows. Jackson, quote, "went to Nauvoo and became quite intimate with Smith and the leaders. Afterwards, turned against them. Went to Warsaw and issued a pamphlet claiming to be an expose of Mormonism and the evil purposes and practices of the prophet. Charges of murder and conspiracy, of counterfeiting, debauchery, spiritual wifery, etc. If half of Jackson's statements were true, the prophet and some of his abettors should have been hung. If not true, Jackson himself should have been hung, in either case without benefit of clergy." End quote. By the end of this episode, I think that you'll find that most of Jackson's statements in his expose were indeed true, and Joseph Smith and some of his abettors should indeed have been hung by this standard, as well as the legal standards of the 1840s. Now, the way I've heard it described when talking to one of the foremost historians of Nauvoo, that's Joseph Johnston, it was that Joseph Jackson's expose should be regarded with skepticism when he talks about his own role or his own competence, not necessarily the material facts that he presents. So what I mean by that is Jackson messes with the information to make himself out to be some kind of hero and to scrub his own name of any wrongdoing in his expose, but the kernels of history data that he provides are mostly accurate. Now, there's a lot that we don't know about Joseph Jackson, as well as counterfeit practices in Nauvoo, but for starters, when it comes to Jackson, we don't know when he was born or where he came from. His biography before he came to Nauvoo is almost a complete mystery. Jackson says that he told Joseph Smith he was a fugitive from justice in Macon County, Georgia. And as far as I know, no historian has been able to verify this, although Kathleen Melanakos notes that Macon, Georgia was, quote, the home of a gang of horse thieves, robbers, and murderers known as the Pony Club, end quote. So according to Joseph Smith, Joseph Jackson introduced himself as a Catholic priest. I mean, okay, right. Mormon apologist Brian Hoglid thinks that this was a lie and he might be right. But again, as far as I know, we have no evidence one way or another regarding whether Jackson had taken orders in the Catholic Church or if he was a member of this pony club, as Kathleen Milanoko says. We just don't know. He didn't kind of act much like a priest, but maybe that's because he used the priesthood as a cover for criminal activity. And of course, that put him in rather good company with Joseph Smith. So once again, 19th century Illinois historian Thomas Gregg, he illustrates the confusion about Jackson's background. In his 1890 History of Mormonism, Gregg describes Jackson as, quote, an adventurer of fine appearance and gentlemanly manners, end quote. But on the very next page, he notes that the Mormons considered him, quote, an adventurer of the worst class, himself a counterfeiter, etc., end quote. It seems that the descriptions of Joseph Jackson seem to adapt depending on who you ask and when, because he was yet another man who joined the church, sort of, and quickly rose through the ranks and then left the church in the city of Nauvoo volcanically at a very controversial time. He was also an opportunist. He saw the Mormon settlement as an opportunity, and we'll see through our examination of him, Jackson seemed to try and keep at least one finger in every pie around the city. He aided and abetted with the greatest enemies of the church, the Laws, Higbees, and Fosters, while simultaneously funneling information back to Joseph Smith about their conduct. In some kind of spy movie, Jackson's like a quadruple agent who we find out at the end that he was only in it for selfish motives to begin with. He's just really a hard guy to nail down, and he's very far from trustworthy. What we do know is that Jackson first arrived in Nauvoo by the way of the Mississippi River. He says he came down the river, which implies that he started the trip upriver in like northern Illinois or up in Wisconsin or something. But once again, we're just trying to read between the lines because his history really is quite enigmatic and hard to understand. He says that he stopped in Nauvoo on October 10th, 1842, quote, partly to find business and partly to gratify his curiosity, end quote, about the Mormons. He took a job there in Nauvoo working for a non-Mormon grocer named John M. Finch, who's been on the episode, on the podcast before. We've just mentioned John M. Finch in passing, notably when he has been associated with legal proceedings. So Joseph Jackson arrived in Nauvoo shortly after Porter Rockwell tried to assassinate Missouri former governor Lilburn W. Boggs, who was running a campaign to become Missouri senator. Tensions between Mormons and the Missourians at this time were very high, and the Mormons were on high alert for Missourian spies. So soon after Jackson's arrival, several of Joseph Smith's, henchmen, his shadow squad, visited Jackson's boarding house, quote, and asked all manner of questions in relation to my business in the city, end quote. Jackson didn't understand why he was being interrogated here, well, according to him anyway, so he refused to answer the questions. Afterward, he noticed that he was often being followed around Nauvoo, and a friend warned him that the Mormons suspected that he was a Missourian spy. So one night, sometime in November of 1842 probably, Jackson was helping his employer haul some goods from the river. Jackson was riding in a wagon after dark when suddenly a man in another wagon called out to him, "Jackson, is that you?" and asked him to come over. So Jackson got out of his wagon and approached the stranger, who also dismounted from his own wagon. So when the two men got within 5 feet of each other, the stranger extended his arm towards Jackson and said, quote, "Damn you, I give you what you deserve," end quote, and then fired a pistol at Joseph Jackson. According to Jackson, the bullet whizzed past his head, and he was so close to the assassin that he had gunpowder burns on his face. His employer, John M. Finch, came running and the assassin fled. However, if we compare this story in different accounts of this happening, he states at one point that it happened on the road by a man who approached him, but another of his account claims that he was on the wharf at Nauvoo unloading cargo from a boat. We just don't really know exactly what happened here, and Jackson is not the most trustworthy guy when it comes to information about himself. Jackson apparently never discovered for certain who had tried to kill him, but he believed that it had been done on orders from Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. The Mormons in Nauvoo were all obviously skeptical of any outsiders, and late 1842 was an exciting time for the kingdom on the Mississippi. However, just because somebody was a stranger in the city, that didn't warrant them being assassinated by a Danite. If this assassination attempt did indeed happen, there's more to the story that Jackson isn't telling us. Nauvoo, understandably, got a little too hot for Jackson, so he fled the city and he spent the winter of 42 to 43 in nearby Carthage, Illinois, the hotbed of the anti-Mormon political party. So there are some really interesting Nauvoo court records from November 1842 that confirm Jackson's story that he was in Nauvoo at the time. Not necessarily the assassination attempt, not necessarily him working for John M. Finch, and a couple of other details, but it confirms that he was actually there. Jackson's role in this story was pretty minor, but I think the story is worth telling because it illustrates how Joseph Smith had perverted and co-opted the justice system in Nauvoo to be his own little banana republic court. The story concerns the case of City of Nauvoo versus Amos Davis, and it begins on November 25th, 1842, when a non-Mormon named Amos Davis said some, quote, abusive or depreciatory things about Joseph Smith. We don't know exactly what it was that Amos Davis said, as is the case with almost all of the cases like this that Joe filed. But on November 29th, the city of Nauvoo charged Davis with violating the city's ordinance, quote, in relation to religious societies. And according to that ordinance, quote, should any person be guilty of ridiculing, abusing, or otherwise depreciating another in consequence of his religion, he shall, on conviction thereof, be considered a disturber of the public peace and fined in any sum not exceeding $500 or imprisoned not exceeding 6 months, or both at the discretion of said mayor or court, end quote. Joseph Smith, who, in addition to being mayor, was also the city prosecutor. Of course, he considered Davis's remarks to be a violation of this law that they had recently passed, and Amos Davis was fined for it. So the court issued subpoenas for several witnesses. One of those was Joseph H. Jackson. Jackson appeared before the court on November 30th, 1842, to testify in this case as a witness for the prosecution. Chauncey Higbee served as an attorney for the defendant, and George P. Stiles served as an attorney for the prosecution. So we see these figures, George P. Stiles, who was a Joseph Smith crony during the Nauvoo Expositor, and Chauncey Higbee, who was a person who was assassinated by the church and by the prophet himself in the public print of the Nauvoo Neighbor and the Times and Seasons, and became one of the publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor. All of these people really know each other. Nauvoo, for all intents and purposes, was a very small town. This case was judged by the Nauvoo City Council with William Marks as president pro tempore. Unfortunately, we have no record of what exactly the witnesses said. What we do know is that the defense attorney, Chauncey Higbee, argued that the prosecution had presented no evidence of a violation of the city ordinance and that the case should be dismissed. But we don't know what was said exactly. Quote, Joseph Smith, the prosecutor for the city, spoke at considerable length by permission of the court, end quote. That's what we get from Joseph Smith. That's all that the court record documents for us. But the aldermen apparently agreed with Higbee, and they ruled in favor of the defendant, with court costs to be paid by the plaintiff. That wasn't the end of this court trial, though. Joseph Smith wasn't satisfied with the city council's judgment, so he had the case retried. And there are two docket records for this case. One version records the proceedings from November 30th and the court's ruling in favor of the defendant. The second version completely omits the proceedings from November 30th as if they never happened. In this version, the trial was held on December 3rd, just a few days later, and it seems like some of the aldermen wanted nothing to do with the retrial because subpoenas were issued to all the aldermen to, quote-unquote, enforce their attendance as judges in the case. Alderman Daniel Spencer and Gustavus Hills didn't show up, and they had to be brought into this retrial by the city marshal, Henry G. Sherwood. Joseph H. Jackson was again subpoenaed as a witness, but this time he didn't show up to testify, perhaps because he had left the city and gone to Carthage between, November 30th and December 3rd, between these two trials. This time around, the court ruled in favor of the prosecution, Joseph Smith, and fined the defendant $50 and full costs of the suit under threat of 6 months imprisonment if he refused to pay the fine. It also put the defendant under a $200 bond to guarantee his good behavior for the next 6 months. Understandably, Amos Davis appealed this case to the circuit court at Carthage, and on January 19th, 1843, that court ordered the city of Nauvoo to, quote, that the record and proceedings in said case be certified to said circuit court at Carthage, and to be in no wise omitted at peril, end quote. So in other words, give us the full record of the case without omitting the proceedings from November 30th. Well, on February 17th, of course, Nauvoo court clerk James Sloan forwarded to Carthage an edited version of the docket record with the proceedings from November 30th completely omitted from the Amos Davis case. At the bottom of the trial record, he perjured himself by writing, "I, James Sloan, clerk of the municipal court within and for the said city of Nauvoo, do hereby certify that the foregoing is a true copy from my docket of the proceedings and judgment in the above case, and that the said transcript and papers contain a full and perfect statement of all the proceedings before said court in said case," end quote. So all of these legal machinations, this gives you a pretty clear idea of what passed for a quote-unquote justice system inside the city of Nauvoo. And we've talked about this a lot on the show. It was Joe's little personal court, and he could do whatever he wanted. Witnesses could be produced, and justice was never properly served. During this Amos Davis debacle, Joseph Jackson apparently spent that winter of 42 to 43 in Carthage, Illinois, stewing on the Mormon attempt to assassinate him just a few months prior. And he was certain that Joseph Smith himself was behind that assassination attempt, and he vowed revenge on the Mormon leader. He returned to Nauvoo in spring of 1843, intending to infiltrate Joseph Smith's inner circle, collect evidence on Smith's villainy, as he said, and expose him to an officer of the law so that Joseph could be brought to justice. At least that's Jackson's version of what happened. Historian Kathleen Melanakos suggests an alternate possibility. Quote, "It seems likely that Jackson was a counterfeiter himself for two reasons. First, he would later be named on the 1845 federal indictments for counterfeiting with other Nauvoo counterfeiters. Secondly, in his pamphlet, he described intimate familiarity with the deceptive methods of counterfeiters. It is possible that Jackson went to Nauvoo specifically to engage in the bogus business and only turned state's evidence when it became expedient," end quote. So in other words, what Melanakos says is his friendship with Joseph may have initially been genuine rather than just a pose that Jackson claimed in his exposés later. Now, there are many ways to look at Jackson and his affiliation with the church. Joseph Smith and the Mormon refugee settlement attracted a lot of people like Joseph Jackson, an amoral opportunist and a counterfeiter, right? Did he actually join the Mormon settlement to expose Joseph Smith? Or did he just do it after he saw how successfully John Bennett's exposé had sold in the second half of 1842 and thought, hey, I could do that too? Did he join Mormonism just to see what keys of ascendancy may be unlocked to him once he gave loyalty to the prophet? Or maybe he was just a grifter, and the new Mormon settlement was his newest set of dupes that he drifted towards. I don't know, right? Jackson was well aware that people might doubt his story about having, intended all along to expose Joseph Smith. So he included in his exposé, which we're going to discuss in a bit here, an affidavit from Hancock County Sheriff Harmon T. Wilson, which says that Jackson told him in the winter of 42 to 43 about his plan to infiltrate Joseph Smith's circle and bring Smith to justice. Several private citizens also provided affidavits to the same effect. So honestly, that goes a long way to support Jackson's story about his motivations initially, before he conducted the spy campaign to infiltrate Joseph Smith's criminal regime. If he tells people that he's going to do it before he does it, that really goes a long way to support his claims. However, it could also be construed as Jackson providing a possible way out. I mean, if he joined his wagon to the Mormon train and then everything went sour, he could publish his expose and claim that it was his motivation all along. But if Mormonism rose to the aspirations that the leadership calculated, then Jackson could have become yet another trusted advisor of the prophet. And anything that he said to Sheriff Harmon Wilson or anybody else about exposing Joseph Smith would be forgotten, right? His deeds or misdeeds while affiliated with the Mormons, including manufacturing bogus money, would never be brought to justice if Joseph Smith were able to acquire the seat of king of the world that he had ambitions for. So whatever may have been the case, Jackson remains a rather enigmatic figure in Mormon history and, well, Nauvoo history specifically, and his real intentions can never be solidly known, meaning his name can easily be cast in both negative and positive light to create competing narratives about his time in Mormonism. Unfortunately for us all, trying to figure this guy out, his actions leave his motivations up to interpretation. For example, back on episode 171, we talked about Daniel and his son Philander Avery being arrested in Illinois and being extradited to Missouri to answer for their crimes. The Mormons feared that this was a predictor of what the sheriffs would do if they ever got their hands on Joseph Smith. So the city passed new ordinances to arrest any officer who enters Nauvoo for the purposes of arresting somebody in the city. The father-son Avery combination spent a few weeks in a Missouri prison just over the border from Warsaw, awaiting their trial. If Daniel Avery stood trial in Missouri, it would reveal a lot of information about Danites and robbery along the Mississippi, the river rats as they were known, the people who just trundled up and down the Mississippi in boats and stole stuff. The property of the Gentiles, I should say. Joe didn't want Daniel Avery standing on trial, right? He didn't want that to happen. So Philander Avery, Daniel's son, escaped prison, and he told Joe what the state of Missouri had planned for his father, Daniel. Joe acted by calling on Joseph H. Jackson to interfere with the scheduled hearing in whatever way possible. Now, this happened in late December of 1843. Philander Avery told Joe that a former Danite named Ebenezer Richardson and a young boy from Montrose named Mark Childs were to be witnesses at Daniel Avery's trial. According to Joseph Jackson, quote, Joe selected several of his Danite band to kidnap the witnesses and placed Captain Jonathan Dunham at the head, end quote. Now, Dunham brought a posse with him. He was accompanied by his fellow soon-to-be policemen, Hosea Stout, Abraham Osmoot, and Daniel Carn, also senior warden of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, Lucius Scoville, and former Missouri Danite Captain Reynolds Cahoon. Now, these are all pretty high-ranking Mormon elite names that have made appearances on the show before, but we haven't done any of these people a proper treatment because many of them are rather inferior figures. But continuing, Jackson was ordered to go along with this band of Danites to kidnap the witnesses as a test of his loyalty to the prophet. If the witnesses couldn't be brought alive, they were to be killed and their bodies dumped in a ravine. If they were successfully brought to Nauvoo, quote, the order of Joe was to tie an iron bar to Richardson's shoulders and throw him into the Mississippi for catfish food, end quote. That's real great. The expedition went awry, though, because of course it did, when a Gentile posse intercepted the Mormons as they were transporting their prisoners back to Nauvoo. There was an altercation, and the Mormon enforcers narrowly escaped back across the river into Illinois. They were met by Joseph Smith on the other side of the river. Quote, on arriving there, we found Joe partially dressed, wrapped in his mantle. He had heard the report of guns on the other side and had got up at this early hour, which was for him very unusual, to see what had happened, end quote. Now, we're able to date this event because Joseph reported it in his journal as follows, quote, About 1 o'clock in the morning, I was alarmed by the firing of a gun, got up and went down to the riverbank to see the guard and inquire the cause of it. To my surprise, they had not heard it, although I felt sure it was fired in Montrose. The morning proved it to be correct. Some rowdies in Montrose had been firing in the night." End quote. That gunshot was actually friendly fire, as the former Danite Richardson assumed the men were there to kill him instead of kidnapping him, which, I mean, if they were able to be brought alive into the city of Nauvoo, their instruction was to tie an iron bar to his shoulders and feed him to the catfishes, so that was probably a pretty solid assumption. So he assumed they were there to kill him instead of kidnapping him, and he shot one of the Danites in the arm. According to Governor Thomas Ford in his History of Illinois, quote, "It was sufficiently proved in a proceeding at Carthage whilst I was there that Joe Smith had sent a band of his followers to Missouri to kidnap 2 men who were witnesses against a member of his church, then in jail and about to be tried on a charge of larceny." End quote. Being trusted enough by the prophet to help his Danites carry out a kidnapping mission to keep witnesses from providing evidence in a court of law means that Jackson was very well trusted by Joseph Smith for at least most of 1843. I mean, the whole situation is sleazy and it's low, but Jackson and Joe were kindred spirits in many ways. Joe tested Jackson's loyalty multiple times by giving him illegal missions like this, the first of which was to break Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell out of Missouri prison, and then kidnapping this man and a child was another one of these horrible missions. Apparently, Jackson did pass the test because they were successfully sequestered in Nauvoo and they failed to testify at the trial. A few days later, according to Jackson anyway, Joe and Jackson had another meeting, this time concerning a growing trouble that would lead it to the expositor in June of 1844. But this meeting was in late December 1843. According to Jackson, quote, "Joe and I had a long talk concerning William Law, in which he avowed his determination to put Law out of the way." Turn Law into catfish food, right? "He then determined on calling out the police, as it was publicly called, but Danites in private. He determined to keep 40 of them on duty, 20 at a time under pay of the city. The reason for this proceeding as given to the people was that he thought it necessary to have a city watch, but the real object as disclosed to me was to murder his enemies. Not only was his design to remove William Law, but also William Marks." Little qualifier, William Marks had a daughter who told her parents of attempted seduction by Joseph Smith. And then William Marks became a Brutus, right? Back to Joseph H. Jackson. Quote, "Now," said he, "I will work it this way. I will keep 20 on watch under the command of Captain Jonathan Dunham, who will select 5 to do the work. And these men will both be missing, and then I'll make a great noise about it and call it persecutions. Now," said he, "ain't this a damned good plan to get rid of traitors?" He then said that he intended to keep up this watch until he had rid the city of his enemies, and there were some in the country whom he also intended should go by the board. He said that the church had already suffered enough from persecutors, and that he would submit no longer. Men must cease their persecutions, or he would give them a dose that would stop them. And of course, Jackson spoke in opposition to this plan, according to Jackson anyway, we don't really know. He said, "Joe accused me of tying his hands and said that he could do nothing if opposed," end quote. It's super hard to tease out the truth in this portion of Jackson's expose, right? Did the meeting actually happen? Did he really oppose Joe's plans to remove William Law and William Marks? Did Joe actually tell Jackson that he was tying his hands by opposing the assassinations of William Law and Marks? Williams, Law, and Marks, I guess. Or was Joe just telling this to Jackson to test his loyalty again, or maybe to poke and prod at who a leaker might be? We simply have no way of telling exactly what happens. Lending credibility to Jackson's version of the story, though, Joe did organize a platoon of the Danites under the direction of Jonathan Dunham to be sworn in as officers of the city. In conjunction with this was Joe's unofficial army of young men soldiers, the Whistling and Whittling Brigade. These were the young men who would sit on street corners in downtown Nauvoo and keep watch on anybody walking through the city. If there was somebody they didn't recognize, they were to collect as much information, watch their travels, see who they were meeting with, and they could funnel all that information back to the prophet. If he gave the order The whistling and whittling brigade would surround the person while they were whistling, and they were whittling sticks with their bowie knives as intimidation. This is how criminal empires work. These policemen patrolled Nauvoo and fed everything that they knew back to the criminal kingpin himself. It's at this point that Jackson may have tried to dabble a little bit on both sides of the veil, because somebody notified William Law that Joe was plotting to kill him. Law brought the case up in court in early January 1844. Now, we discussed this back on episode 178 about William Judas Law, when Joe named a Brutus or a Judas within the ranks. Joe intimidated William Law on the stand at the Nauvoo Municipal Court hearing, and Law initially refused to talk. Eventually, William Law bowed to the power of the tyrant and told this, it's not really a municipal court, it's kind of like, it's a tribunal, right? So he told the tribunal that a man named Eli Norton had told him about the assassination attempt against his life. Now, Eli Norton wasn't a member of the newly commissioned Nauvoo police force who were supposed to carry out the assassination, but he was friends with a guy named Daniel Carn, who was one of these police officers. Apparently, Eli Norton learned about the assassination plot from Daniel Carn, who was supposed to be one of the guys who tied the stick to the Richardson's shoulders and turned him into catfish food. During this hearing, William Law said just enough to get him out of the situation. However, he and his brother Wilson confronted Joseph Smith 2 days later in the presence of Joseph Jackson, who reported the confrontation in his expose. Quote, Joseph became very angry that any should have any fears or suspect that he would encourage such a thing about assassinating them, and said that he had a good mind to put the police on us anyhow, we were such fools, or words to that effect. Now, this remark, of course, infuriated the Laws. Quote, some hard words passed between us. And according to Joseph Jackson, Smith's remark, quote, so exasperated Wilson Law that he drew a pistol and made Joe swallow his words in a hurry. So great was the excitement that it was with difficulty that William Law and Hiram Smith could prevent Wilson from firing, end quote. So Wilson Law nearly shot Joseph Smith in January of 1844. Charles Foster nearly shot Joe only 3 months later. Joseph Smith knew how to make enemies, right? Throughout the growing tensions between Joe and the Laws, Joseph H. Jackson was actually inducted into the city police force, meaning the Danite squad tasked with patrolling the city for anybody who may oppose the prophet. Notably, some Mormon historians like Brian Hales will claim that within only a week of Joe and Jackson meeting, their friendship had suffered irreparable damage, and that they were growing enemies beginning sometime in the spring of 1843. But that isn't the case. Jackson was elevated to higher and higher levels of trust and loyalty in Mormonism throughout all of 1843 and early 1844. Jackson was also probably feeding information to the Laws as they grew to be public enemies number one of the prophet. Jackson hedged his bets, and he tried to play on all sides of the growing conflict between Joseph Smith and the dissenters. As of late January 1844, Jackson was referred to as Colonel Jackson by Joseph Smith himself in his own journal. However, it may be the case that Joe was smart enough to keep his friends close and his enemies closer, and by elevating Jackson to the Nauvoo police force, he could keep closer tabs on Jackson. By late February 1844, according to Jackson anyway, Joe had conceived of a plan to get rid of Jackson. Now, this was recorded as part of Jackson's expose without any further corroborating documents, but apparently Joe orchestrated a scenario in the Quorum of Apostles to get rid of Jackson and make it look like an accident that was common of frontier American life. Quote, the 12 met, according to Joseph Council, to discuss selecting a company to explore Oregon and California and select a site for a new city for the Saints, end quote. So Jonathan Dunham and Phineas Young, brother of Brigham Young, Bloody Brigham Young, they volunteered to be part of this council, this committee, this company to explore Oregon and California for a new Mormon settlement. Among the others selected, James Emmett and Daniel Spencer. Joseph H. Jackson claimed he was warned by, quote, a certain lady who had heard Joe Hiram and Dr. Willard Richards, that's Whiteout Willard Richards, in conversation, end quote, that the sole purpose of this expedition was to have Jackson killed. He was to be put in charge of this expedition company as a former resident of California, and the company would, quote, get started and the Danites would kill me And then the company would return to Nauvoo and report that the Indians had shot their pilot and they were obliged to return. As soon as I refused to go to California, the whole matter dropped and I heard no more of the expedition." End quote. Understandably, when Jackson learned of the plot to kill him hatched by the prophet and the quorum of apostles, that was his point of no return, right? He knew Nauvoo was coming to a breaking point, and if the rumors of his past life before Nauvoo are any indicator, Jackson had quite a drive for self-preservation, and he could recognize when situations were getting out of control. Notably as well, Jackson wasn't inducted into the Council of 50 at this time, which was formed of the most trusted elites just half a month after the plan to kill him was formed. A person like Jackson rising through the ranks of the Mormon kingdom and into the Council of the Danites, we'd expect to see him inducted into this super secretive Council of 50 society, but his absence reveals that there was skepticism of his loyalty by Joseph Smith. This skepticism seems to have run both directions, though. Joe was skeptical of Jackson, but Jackson knew all along that Joe couldn't be trusted. And it was around this time that Jackson likely began devising his exit strategy, possibly in collusion with the Laws, the Fosters, and the Higbees, who were all devising their own exit strategies. Look, the Fosters, Higbees, and Laws, they were never good friends with Joseph H. Jackson, but it seems like one of those enemy of my enemy situations here. By late March 1844, Joe preached on the stand that there was a plot to kill him. Quote, "I have been informed by two gentlemen that a conspiracy's got up in this place for the purpose of taking the life of President Joseph Smith, his family, and all the Smith family, and the heads of the church. The names," he's speaking in the third person here, "the names of the persons revealed at the head of the conspiracy are as follows: Chauncey L. Higby, Dr. Robert D. Foster, Mr. Joseph H. Jackson, William Wilson Law. And the lies that Chauncey L. Higby has hatched up as a foundation to work upon are, he says, that I had men's heads cut off in Missouri, and that I had run a sword through the hearts of the people that I wanted to kill and put out of the way. I won't swear out a warrant against them, for I don't fear any of them. They would not scare off an old setting hen. I intend to publish all the iniquity that I know of them. If I am guilty, I am ready to bear it. There is sometimes honor among enemies." End quote. With Jackson named among the enemies who would publish the prospectus of the Nauvoo Expositor only barely a month after Joe made this screed, Jackson was officially marked as an enemy. However, there are some interesting details in Jackson's expose which merit mentioning here. It's clear to me that Jackson counted some members of the Council of 50 as friends, and he was able to get information from those friends, even if he himself wasn't allowed to attend those meetings. This data to which I'm referring strikes at some of Joe's greatest ambitions of global domination. On March 14th, the second official meeting of the Council of 50, a guy named Uriah Brown was inducted into the Council of 50. Uriah Brown was a non-Mormon, only one of only two members of the Council of 50 who weren't actually Mormons. Uriah Brown was an inventor who had an offer for Joe's Mormon theocracy revolution. Now, we discussed this offer way back on episode 71 when we had Tom and Cecil from Cognitive Dissonance on the podcast to talk about the worst POTUS candidate ever. Now, I'm going to read a pretty large chunk, and this is straight from a footnote of the Council of 50 Minutes on the Joseph Smith Papers project. This is the church's own website about the Council of 50 Minutes, their own footnote concerning Uriah Brown and his invention and offer for Joe's Council of 50. Quote, "Uriah Brown was a non-Mormon friend of Joseph Smith and the first of three non-Mormons added to the Council of 50 in 1844. Sorry, I said one of two. I meant one of three. My mistake. I made a mistake there. Anyway, Joseph Smith explained that these men had been included to demonstrate that the kingdom of God operated on, quote, the broad and liberal principles that all men have equal rights, end quote, regardless of religious denomination. During the War of 1812, Uriah Brown had invented a naval weapon described as Greek fire that would propel liquid fire at enemy ships. This weapon had elicited occasional interest by the U.S. government. It is unclear whether Brown's weapon influenced Joseph Smith's decision to add him to the Council of 50. In January 1843, Joseph Smith reviewed plans for the weapon with Uriah Brown and informed him that, quote, He had thought that the Lord had designed the apparatus for some more magnificent purpose than for the defense of nations, end quote. Joseph H. Jackson, an enemy of Joseph Smith, later claimed that Joseph Smith persuaded Brown to attempt to sell the weapon to Russia while secretly planning to use the weapon as a bartering tool to negotiate an alliance with the Russian emperor. However, there is no discussion of the weapon in the council record during the Nauvoo era and scant discussion elsewhere, so the reliability of Jackson's accusation is difficult to assess. This is from the Council of 50 Minutes on the Joseph Smith Papers. I'm reading a footnote from the Joseph Smith Papers. Continuing on. In 1851, the Council of 50 discussed an offer by Brown, who had been dropped by the council in 1845, to sell the weapon to Brigham Young so that it could be used to defend Mormon settlements in the Great Basin. During that discussion, I'm sorry, I'm just baffled by that statement. To sell the weapon to Brigham Young so that it could be used to defend Mormon settlements in the Great Basin. Brigham Young wanted a flamethrower to make his genocide of Native Americans more effective, and he approached Uriah Brown for it. Anyway, continuing with this footnote on the church's own website, during that discussion, Almon Babbitt identified the weapon with, quote-unquote, the Russian mission. Babbitt also recalled Joseph Smith's favorable reception of the invention and stated that he was, quote, in favor of carrying out the views of Joseph and thinks it a matter worthy of our notice, end quote. Though neither Babbitt nor anyone else at the 1851 meeting indicated what Joseph Smith's intentions may have been for the weapon, end quote. They also include citations of the Council of 50 records for April 11th, 1844, Joseph Smith's journal for January 8th, 1843, and then Jackson's expose, page 30, as well as the Council of 50 minutes in August of 1851, and the Council of 50 papers collection from 1845 to 1883. So, okay, that's on the church's own website, and that's straight from the Joseph Smith Papers site. That's linked in the show notes. You can read that footnote for yourself. According to Joseph H. Jackson's expose, Joe added Uriah Brown to the Council of 50 because Uriah Brown had devised plans to construct a submarine with a flamethrower mounted on it, which Joe wanted to sell to Russia in order to gain credibility with the Tsar and overthrow the American government. The fact that this weapon system isn't recorded in any Nauvoo meeting minutes of even the most secretive councils and only later to alluded by the Utah Territory presidency under Brigham Young, that illustrates to us that there were plans much greater for the Nauvoo war machine than the available documents reveal to us. We only learn of this Russia collusion and weapon of mass destruction plan from Jackson, which leads most historians to regard the assertion as bunk. But the fact that Bloody Brigham approached Uriah Brown half a decade after Joe's death to inquire about the availability of a flamethrower on a submarine is evidence enough for me that such a plan was in place, and Jackson had access to those plans without being able to attend the Council of 50 meetings himself. Jackson was continuing to play all sides of the rising conflict in Nauvoo, though. According to Joseph Smith's mom, Lucy Mack Smith, her biographical sketches discuss Jackson as an enemy of her two sons and of the church at large. Now, while Lucy Mack Smith isn't very solid on dates in her reminiscences, we can nail down a rough date of sometime in March 1844 when the described event transpired. According to Lucy, Joseph H. Jackson took a bit of a shining to Hiram Sidekick Abiff Smith's daughter, Lavina, who was a teenager at the time. Quote from Lucy Mack Smith. About this time, a man by the name of Joseph Jackson, who had been in the place several months, became enamored of Hiram's Miss Lavina Smith, Hiram's oldest daughter, and asked her father's permission to marry her. Being refused, Jackson went and requested Joseph to use his influence in Jackson's favor. This Joseph refused to do. He next applied to William Law, who was our secret enemy, for assistance in stealing Lavina from her father, and from this time forth continued seeking out our enemies till he succeeded in getting a number to join him in a conspiracy to murder the whole Smith family. They commenced holding secret meetings, one of which was attended by a man named Eaton, who was our friend, and he exposed the plot. This man declared that the Higbees, Laws, and Fosters were all connected with Joseph Jackson in his operations. There was also another individual named Augustine Spencer, a dissolute character, although a member of an excellent family, who I believe was concerned in this conspiracy. About the time of Eaton's disclosures, Mr. Spencer went to the house of his brother, Orson Spencer, and abused my sons in the church at such a great rate that Orson finally told him that he must either stop or leave the house. Augustine refused and they grappled. In the contest, Orson was considerably injured. He went immediately to Joseph's and, stating the case, asked for a warrant. Joseph advised him to go to Dr. Robert D. Foster, who was a justice of the peace. He therefore went and demanded a warrant of Foster, but was refused. For this refusal, Foster was brought before Esquire Daniel H. Wells and tried for non-performance of duty. At this trial, Joseph met Charles Foster, the doctor's brother, who attempted to shoot Joseph as soon as they met, but was prevented by Joseph's catching his hands and holding him by main force. And in this way, he was compelled to confine him above an hour in order to preserve his own life. Jackson and the apostates continued to gather strength till finally they established a printing press in our midst. Through this organ they belched forth the most intolerable and blackest lies that was ever palmed upon a community. The city council, being advised by men of influence and standing to have this scandalous press removed, took the matter into consideration, and finding that the law would allow them to do so, they declared it a nuisance and had it treated accordingly. At this, the apostates left the city in a great rage, swearing vengeance against Joseph and the city council, and in fact the whole city. They went forthwith to Carthage and swore out writs for Joseph and all those who were in any wise concerned in the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor Press. But having no hopes of justice in that place, the brethren took out a writ of habeas corpus and were tried before Esquire Wells in Nauvoo. With this, the apostates were not satisfied. They then called upon one Levi Williams, who was a bitter enemy to us whenever he was sufficiently sober to know his own sentiments, for he is drunk and illiterate, ignorant brute that never had a particle of character or influence until he began to call mob meetings and place himself at the head of a rabble like unto himself to drive the Mormons, when he was joined by certain unmentionable ones in Warsaw and Carthage, and for his zeal in promoting mobocracy, he became the intimate acquaintance and confidential friend of some certain preachers, lawyers, doctors, squires, and representatives, and finally of Joseph Jackson and the apostates. And now as Colonel Levi Williams, he commands the militia, alias mob, of Hancock County. We see where Joseph Smith gets his rambling tendencies. On this man, I can say they called for assistance to drag Joseph and Hiram with the rest of the council to Carthage. Levi Williams swore it should be done and gathered his band together. Joseph, not choosing to fall into the hands of wolves or tigers, called upon the legion to be in readiness to defend the city and its chartered rights. End quote. Okay, so that was crazy, right? So Lucy gets us from early 1844 into June of 1844. She gets us to the exact location where our timeline currently rests, in middle of June 1844, with Joe calling out the Nauvoo Legion to answer for the riot that was caused by him and his marshal burning the printing press of the Nauvoo Expositor. Now, I want to tease out a few details from Lucy's account, though, because they're really important and she sort of glossed over them. She claims that Jackson was the head of the band of anti-Mormons in the city, which was comprised of the Fosters, Higbees, and Laws. Jackson, however, was never named as one of the publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor. He was a man who had a particular relationship with the English language, which could have been for the Expositor's benefit, but Jackson wasn't named in the prospectus or in the Expositor itself at any point, nor is he attributed anywhere in the paper as a source of information about the outrages that the Expositor reports. Jackson would never choose to be a silent partner in such an endeavor, as he was a man who gloried in his own infamy. Unless, however, he was still trying to play all of the sides of the conflict with the Laws, the Fosters, and the Higbees, and they regarded him as not trustworthy enough to be part of their clan. I don't know. I don't know what to make of all of it. Notably, as well, Lucy talked about Charles Foster pulling a pistol on Joseph Smith when he, his brother Robert, and William Law refused to aid the city marshal in arresting Augustine Spencer. However, Lucy said that it was her son who parried the gun and disarmed Wilson and had to hold him down for an hour to, I guess, to stop the thing from happening, to stop him from killing you, and to stop him from like retaliating or fighting back? I don't know. Like, why did Joe had to hold him down on the ground for an hour? I don't understand. But notably, Joe's journal says that it was actually Robert Foster who removed the pistol from his brother's hand. And another statement to the facts claims that it was Pistol Packin' Porter who disarmed and subdued Charles Foster. Memory is a really fickle thing, especially when moms are telling the world about their little angels who could do no wrong, right? Also, the concept that Jackson was after Hiram's daughter is quite striking. Her claim that he went to Joseph to get his help in soliciting Hiram's daughter for a plural wife means that even in March of 1844, Jackson felt comfortable enough around Joe to make such a request while he was simultaneously meeting with the Fosters, Higbees, and Laws. It looks to me like Jackson was hedging his bets in all directions with the expectation that he could jump on whichever ship wasn't sinking at a moment's notice. Oddly enough, as evidence of the fact that Jackson was playing both sides, we find out from the history of the church that it was actually Jackson who told M.G. Eaton about the plot to assassinate Joe by the Fosters, Higbees, and Laws, which Joe apparently brought in Jackson and the Higbees, Fosters, and Laws into the conspiracy to kill him. But it was actually Jackson who told Eaton, who went and told Joe about the conspiracy. According to an affidavit that was filed on March 27th, 1844 by Abiathar B. Williams, I'm not sure how to say that name. This is what Williams says about this circumstance. Quote, during the time we were walking, said Joseph H. Jackson said that he was then coming direct from Mr. Laws, that's William Laws, that there was going to be a secret meeting in the city of Nauvoo probably tomorrow evening, but as it was not decided, he could not say positively as to the time, but he would inform me in season. The said Joseph H. Jackson said that Dr. Foster, Chauncey L. Higbee, and the Laws were red hot for a conspiracy, and he should not be surprised if in 2 weeks there should not be one of the Smith family left alive in Nauvoo. After we arrived at Mr. Loomis's near the Masonic Hall in the city of Nauvoo, he related some things which he stated that Dr. Foster had said relative to his family. This he did in the presence of Mr. Eaton and myself, and strongly solicited myself and Mr. Eaton to attend the secret meeting and join them in their intentions. End quote. Joe had stated in his March 24th sermon that Jackson was named among those who were trying to get up the plot to kill him, yet he also funneled that information to a Joe crony, M.G. Eaton, who then fed that information back to Joe. The reasoning provided by Eaton that Jackson used for telling him about the plot was to tell Eaton to jump ship, right? The ship's a sinking, the city's on fire, and in 2 weeks, every Smith is going to be dead, so come over to the side that's going to win. But what's incredibly fascinating about all of this is that M.G. Eaton was a friend of Jackson's in the bogus business. M.G. Eaton helped Joseph Jackson manufacture counterfeit coins. Eaton had previously lived in New York, but he fled the state of New York on counterfeiting charges. M.G. Eaton, Peter Hawes, and Joseph Jackson were three of the primary bogus coin makers in Nauvoo and across the Mississippi in the Mormon settlement in Iowa. It's truly amazing, and trying to tease out the power dynamics and who was feeding information to who and for the reasons that they were feeding specific information to each other is so confusing and hard to wrap our minds around, right? However, Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith, Joe's closest advisor, his older brother, didn't believe that the Laws were conspiring with Jackson. He instead laid the conspiracy to kill Joe and the whole Mormon family at the feet of Jackson himself. According to Hiram Smith, quote, Mr. Laws have done a great deal of good, and when we can see anything in the conspiracy, it was presumed that the rascal Joseph Jackson who presumed it upon them, and I do not believe that the Mr. Law would do anything against me. It was the rascal Jackson who did it, and he did it, and I would not believe Jackson if he was to swear on a stack of Bibles as big as Mount Etna. End quote. Stack of Bibles as big as Mount Etna? Does the size of the stack of Bibles make the swearer more trustworthy? Like, if the stack of Bibles that Jackson swore on was as big as, like, the whole Himalayan mountain range, would you believe him? If the stack was as big as the moon, would you believe him? Is an oath on one of those, like, little Bible passages that's printed on, like, a grain of rice automatically false? Whatever, it doesn't matter. But Soon after Hiram made this speech in the High Council of Nauvoo, he received an anonymous letter on May 12, 1844, quote, supposed to have been written by Joseph H. Jackson, threatening his life and calling upon him to make his peace with God or he would soon have to die, end quote. Now, this letter itself is no longer extant. All we know is what Hiram Smith testified about it in the city council. So we can't tell if it is indeed Jackson who wrote it or what the letter actually said, but it does seem quite plausible at this time. This was on May 12th, 2 days after the prospectus of the Nauvoo Expositor had been printed, and it seems that Jackson was getting ready to hitch his wagon to the dissenter party in Nauvoo. For the remainder of May and into June 1844, Jackson seems to bounce back and forth between Carthage and Nauvoo quite a bit. In late May of 1844, Jackson took a posse of Danites with him to Carthage to testify to his character, only a week and a half before the Expositor was published. They stopped for the night at Hamilton's Hotel between Carthage and Nauvoo, where they found Charles Foster, one of the printers of the Expositor, and Joe talked with him for a while, according to Joseph Smith, quote, I had considerable conversation with Charles Foster, and he appeared to be more mild than previously, and as though he was almost persuaded that he had been influenced to some extent by false reports, end quote. Now, we know that this is an inaccurate account of the conversation which transpired between Joseph Smith and Charles Foster here, because Foster is the guy who pointed a double-barrel pistol at Joseph Smith only a month before. What cooled his temperament? Who knows, right? We know that this cannot possibly be accurate. But then Joe reports the information that Foster told him during this conversation, quote, that there were some persons who were determined I should not go out of Carthage alive. Jackson was seen to reload his pistols and was heard to swear he would have satisfaction of me and Hiram, end quote. And indeed, when Joe, Hiram, and their Danite posse left Carthage to return to Nauvoo on May 28th, that's where Joseph Smith gave his famous sermon, I have more to boast of than ever any man had. I held a church together. The followers of Jesus ran away from him, but the saints haven't run away from me yet. That's when he gave the speech, May 28th. This is what Joseph recorded, quote, there were many people about in small groups. Jackson stood on the green with 1 or 2 men some distance off. End quote. But Jackson couldn't strike because the tyrant was surrounded by his underground guard of shadow enforcers. It would have been a suicide mission to strike then and there by Joseph Jackson. Instead, Jackson chose to assassinate the prophet with an expose that he wrote and published in the Warsaw Signal 4 days after he exchanged glances across the grassy knoll. There was a problem with Jackson trying to play all sides of the conflict here because he'd lost credibility with all sides, right? The Expositor publishers didn't want anything to do with him. People that he considered his secret allies were feeding his confidential information back to the prophet. He'd become an enemy of the prophet and he couldn't get himself a wife of the patriarch's oldest daughter. He was just generally distrusted by everybody with whom that he had shared time and correspondence for the past 2 years of his life. However, just because Jackson wasn't trustworthy doesn't mean that he couldn't be used by the anti-Mormon group to turn up the heat on the prophet. So he wrote his expose for the Warsaw Signal, which turned up the heat and in some ways set the stage for the Nauvoo Expositor, which was published only a week later. And arguably because of Jackson's first expose here, the Nauvoo Expositor had a greater impact. Here it is. Quote, startling disclosures! In full caps. Scary. Gotta read this now. This is in the Warsaw Signal. Carthage, June 1st, 1844. Mr. Editor, having been a short time since a rather conspicuous character in this community on account of my connection with Joseph, I am anxious to convey to the public through your columns the motives that actuate my conduct, and thus clear away false impressions which my former conduct has tended to produce. Yeah, the fact that nobody trusts you? Yeah, okay. In hopes that the following plain statements of facts, which can be substantiated by unquestionable testimony, will produce this effect, I submit it for the information of your readers. In the fall of 1842, I visited Nauvoo, and although I have no knowledge of having done anything which should have aroused suspicion, I was informed that I was regarded with distrust by His Holiness and marked down accordingly as a spy. A short time after this, I had proof that this information was authentic, for incontestable evidence was given of the hostile designs of Joe towards me. One evening after dark, as I was riding in a wagon with a friend, we met another wagon coming from an opposite direction. A voice from the latter cried out as we passed, "Jackson, is that you?" I answered in the affirmative. "I wish to see you," said the stranger. I got out of the wagon and walked to meet the individual who accosted me, who had also left the wagon in which he rode. The wagons passed on and we neared each other when suddenly the stranger fired a pistol. The ball whizzed by my head and the assassin fled. I saw no more of him, but the effect of this incident was to make me resolved to be avenged if the cunning of man could accomplish what I so much desired. I saw plainly from what I had heard that Joe Smith was the instigator of the villain who attempted to take my life without provocation, and I thought to myself that it should not be my fault if he were made to smart for his villainy. Shortly after this, I quit Nauvoo and spent the winter in Carthage. In the spring of 1843, I told Harmon T. Wilson that I was determined to head Joe, and in order to do so, that I would go to Nauvoo, insinuate myself into his favor, win his affection and confidence, and that if he really was a villain, I would find out, and at a proper season I would disclose all to him, that as an officer of the law he might have an opportunity to bring the scamp to justice. Accordingly, I returned to Nauvoo and sought Joe's favor. He protested he was a man of God. I told him I knew his heart, that his religion was a humbug, and I wanted to hear none of it. I represented myself as an outlaw and fugitive from justice, ready to do whatever he commanded. For a long time, Joseph persisted in his professions of holiness, but finally seeing that I was not gullible enough to believe his sanctified professions, and having succeeded in making him believe that I was a proper tool for his uses, he gave in, and acknowledged to me his proper character and principles. He admitted himself an atheist, and the Book of Mormon a humbug, and that the original was written by Lyman Spalding, whose heirs now have it in their possession. By degrees, I entwined myself completely into his confidence. I seemed ready to perform whatever I was commanded, and to the world kept up the appearance that I was in reality what I seemed to be. I succeeded in my object. Every plot, every plan, every secret movement of the villainous system by which Joe deludes and strips his followers was made known to me, and before God I say that a more detestable miscreant treads not the earth, steeped in blood and crime, guilty by his own admissions of almost every act of wickedness that the machinations of hell can suggest to mortal man. He stands before the devil, but even as the rival of his satanic majesty. But the limits of this communication will not allow me to particularize. Suffice it to say that Joe disclosed to me while in his confidence that he did send O.P. Rockwell to Missouri to assassinate Governor Boggs. He stated too the particulars. I was sent on the mission to liberate him after he had been taken. I know all the facts in relation to this affair and will soon disclose them to the world. After Rockwell had returned, Joe offered me $3,000 if I would do what Rockwell had failed to do, to wit, take the life of Boggs. I consented. I visited Missouri for the purpose of keeping up appearances with him, and on my return excused myself for not having done what I would have shrunk with horror from doing, by telling him that Boggs was not at home. This alone brands Joe as an assassin, but this is not all I know of his murderous purposes. He attempted to hire myself and others to take the life of some of our most valuable citizens. I will not at present name them, but I will say from what I know that his enemies are not safe. Looking at you, publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor, his enemies are not safe. He has a ruffian band around him ready to execute whatever he commands, and who are only deterred by the fear of detection. The fact that Joe was engaged in counterfeiting also came to my knowledge while in his confidence. Besides this, a baser and more unscrupulous seducer lives not. I could name his victims, but regard for their feelings deter me. The limits I have prescribed for this communication compels me to desist from further remarks at this time. I know that my life is sought by Joe, but I also know that, should I be suddenly cut off, my death will be attributed to the proper source and amply revenged. I've said enough already to convince the world that while in Nauvoo, my motive was not that which was then attributed to me. The fact that I made it known to Harmon T. Wilson, my object in going there, will unfold the mystery of my conduct. Yours respectfully, signed Joseph H. Jackson. End quote. Here we can see Jackson's way of writing his expose. Now, this wasn't his full-length pamphlet expose. That wouldn't be published until August of 1844, which is a little late for what it contained about Joseph Smith because the dude was already dead. But this was the first of his exposés, and we can see how he tries to remove any wrongdoing on his own part while still presenting facts. Now, he does this with the reasoning that he needs to explain his conduct and justify why everybody hates him, right? Then he tells truths about Joe mixed with probably falsehoods. He claims Joe told him outright that he was an atheist, which used in this terminology that was pejorative. That was a slur of the day, and it's still used as a pejorative to some extent today. And that Joseph admitted that the Book of Mormon was written by Lyman Spalding, also known as Solomon Spalding, whose heirs now hold the manuscript. You see, I think I'm pretty safe in saying that this whole thing that Jackson claimed that Joe said, that was all just a lie, right? Joe kept a lot of secrets, even though he was quite a talker. To let Jackson in so quickly after so recently being burned by Reckitt Bennett, it just strains credulity. But then Jackson became aware of bogus making in Nauvoo to the same extent that I became aware this week that I do a podcast, right? His whole life was marked by counterfeiting, and finding that the Mormons were a recipient population to counterfeiting, that was a fish jumping out of a lake into an ocean, right? Then he talks about the female victims that he refuses to name who had become prey of the prophet. Now, yeah, the thing is Jackson was probably just as horrible with women as Joseph Smith was, right? They were kindred scoundrels in that regard, so his sensitive reporting of this sensitive matter, it rings kind of hollow to me. But then Joe offering $3,000 to Jackson to carry out the mission that Porter Rockwell failed, that's incredibly likely. In Jackson's August expose, he goes into a lot more detail of what happened there, but the $3,000 likely paid in either inflated land deeds or in bogus anyway. That was a reasonable amount for assassinating a political opponent, right? Port, after he attempted the assassination, he got the nicest carriage in town upon his return from that first assassination attempt because Joe knew that to keep loyal followers, you have to keep them comfortable. Then Jackson claiming that Joe hired him and others to kill members of their society. That's definitely the laws. That's the laws for sure, because Jackson was the one who told William Law that Joe wanted him dead, which allowed William Law to bring a legal complaint against Joseph Smith in the first place. But how Jackson chose to wrap the editorial is pretty fascinating to me. If I die, you know who did it. If anybody questions my motives, talk to Sheriff Harmon T. Wilson, who I told about my spy plan before I did it. Now, this reveals to me that he legitimately feared for his life, and printing that at the end was a bit of an insurance policy. So, look, Jackson was a super complicated guy. After he published this initial expose, June 1st, 1844, and the Nauvoo Expositor was published June 7th, 1844, Jackson had finally declared which side he was on in this whole affair. Notably, Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith talked about Jackson extensively during the city council meetings about how to deal with the Nauvoo Expositor. Now, over the past few episodes, when Jackson's name has come up and I've just said, well, we'll have to do Jackson a proper treatment, we have to slot him into the timeline. Those are the statements that Hiram and Joseph were talking about Jackson. But Hiram talks about this whole thing, Jackson wanting his daughter, Lavina Smith. And it's really interesting. Hiram, he may have been lying. He may have been telling the truth. It's really tough to know. But he told the city council about Jackson and about how horrible of a man that Jackson was. It starts out quoting Joseph. This is the city council minutes quote. Mayor said that William Law had offered Joseph Jackson $500 to kill him. Counselor Hiram Smith continued. Now Hiram is saying this. Jackson told him Jackson, meant to have his daughter, Lavina Smith, and threatened him if he made any resistance. Jackson related to him a dream that Joseph and Hiram were opposed to him, but that he would execute his purposes, that Jackson had laid a plan with 4 or 5 persons to kidnap his daughter and threatened to shoot anyone that should come near after he got her in the skiff, that Jackson was engaged in trying to make bogus, which was his principal business, end quote. Should we trust these accusations by Hiram Smith about Joseph H. Jackson? Was Joseph Smith telling the truth about William Law trying to hire Jackson to kill Joseph for $500? Was Hiram telling the truth about Jackson wanting to kidnap his daughter? Was Jackson a predator who would take Lavina Smith against her and her father's will? Or were Lavina Smith and Jackson actually friends or dating, but Hiram didn't like Jackson and he was saving his oldest daughter to be sealed to somebody else? My brain is scrambled here. The truth is we can't trust anything that any of these guys said about each other. There may be some truth in a later statement during the same city council meeting by Lorenzo Wasson, and he said, quote, Joseph H. Jackson had told witness that bogus making was going on in the city, but it was too damned small business. Wanted witness to help him procure money, for the General Smith was afraid to go into it. And with $500, he could get an engraving for bills on the Bank of Missouri and one on the state of New York and could make money, end quote. Yeah, look, making counterfeit bogus or counterfeit bills with the Bank of Missouri stamped onto it, that would have been really helpful for all of Emma's supply trips to St. Louis to procure supplies for the Red Brick store. So, of course, Joe and Emma were both plugged into the bogus business, as it was probably a primary source of income for both of them. This is yet another case where any accusations of immoral or illegal behavior lobbed at Jackson splash damages the prophet and his closest circles. There's so much more about Jackson to incorporate into the timeline, especially as we get through the remainder of June of 1844. There was a confrontation between a Missourian and a Mormon in Carthage, and Jackson stopped the Missourian from killing the Mormon by repeatedly stabbing him. And he figures even more heavily into the eventual assassination at Carthage. But what do we make of Joseph Jackson? Joseph H. Jackson had a relatively short stint with the Mormons in Nauvoo. And he was so clearly an opportunist, and he didn't seem to hold any ideology of any sort. His history before Nauvoo is a mystery. He drops completely from the Mormon radar after his expose following the assassinations of Joe and Hiram. He's an incredibly enigmatic figure. However, in some ways, he followed the same path blazed by opportunists before him. I can't help but notice many parallels between him and John C. Reckitt Bennett. The primary difference is that it seems Jackson was at least honest with himself about the fact that he was a scoundrel and a pariah, whereas Bennett put on a face of respectability and arrogance about conducting similar misdeeds as Jackson did. What Jackson's motivations were for joining the Mormons in the first place may have been similar, simplistic reasons used by many to join the settlement. It provided plenty of opportunities, especially for those unscrupulous folks who sought only their own aggrandizement, like Jackson clearly did. Maybe the rumors of multiple wives played to Jackson's interests, and he sought elevation to acquire a few of his own. I don't know. That was understandably a selling point for a lot of people who joined the Mormon settlement. But another set of questions arise here, and they center around how honest Joe was with Jackson and how accurate was Jackson at recounting their interactions and what Joe told him. Now, we're going to have to do a deep dive into Jackson's full pamphlet expose in coming episodes, but the details contained therein paint a picture of Joseph Smith as a genuinely evil person. And what complicates this analysis even more is that Jackson speaks to what I know of Joseph Smith quite accurately, albeit in ye olde 19th century language, right? To anybody reading Jackson's exposés, especially at the time, he fed the hungry wolves the scent of recently killed flesh, right? It could be that Jackson was simply attempting to capitalize on the public fury that was motivating the anti-Mormons to a military campaign against the Nauvoo settlement. And he was just adding energy into the already destructive feedback loop that would result in the deaths of 3 Smiths and the exile of the Mormons from the state of Illinois in only half a decade's time. Besides all of this, Jackson made his living in Nauvoo from one of the greatest acts of deception in our society: counterfeit, fake, lying. That's how he paid his bills, making fake money known as Nauvoo Bogus, usually printed to look like Bank of Missouri or Bank of New York coins. If a person's chief source of income is lies, can we trust anything they say? Can we? These complicated factors make Jackson a complicated figure in Mormon history. He has all of the trappings of a typical rabid anti-Mormon, so nothing he says will be believed by the majority of people who study Mormon history, regardless of how reliable it is. But then to believe everything that Joe and Hiram ever said about Jackson leaves a very simplistic view of like good guys versus bad guys in Nauvoo, when the world can never be boiled down to that childish dichotomy. Jackson was a lowly criminal actor within a massive criminal system, and to distrust his statements while believing the statements of the criminal kingpins is pathetically motivated reasoning. I personally see Jackson as the kind of criminal who you could always count on to steal your wallet, but will usually tell you the truth about the gossip going on around town. Joseph Smith, on the other hand, strikes me as the criminal who wears a suit and then buys your mortgage from your bank, raises your payments, and then forecloses on you, all while smiling and shaking your hand, saying he knows what's best for you. A person stealing your wallet is criminal and it sucks, but it doesn't leave you and your family homeless and completely ruin your life, while you're calling that person who did that to you your God because he wouldn't possibly lie to you, right? The wallet thief gets the press. He gets thrown in jail and he lives the rest of his life committing petty crime. The mortgage thief never has an article written about him. He never goes to jail, and he gets richer every day by continuing to commit these legal crimes until he gets elected president. Both of them are opportunists, but the former suffers from a lack of scope of their crimes. If you do it at a systematic level, you never get punished. Joseph made his money by literally making his money. Joseph Smith made his money by creating an entire society which relied upon his every word to survive, and he fed the sheep just enough drivel to keep them hungry for more. Both are profoundly dishonest, but only one requires religion to work. What's even more interesting to me is that the issue with bogus money and Joe hiding his fugitive cousin Jeremiah Smith from the law for his counterfeiting, those were the most effective accusations against Joseph Smith by the Nauvoo expositor, right? Counterfeiting money and harboring criminals. At least those were the accusations which stuck the most and were immediately dealt with by the criminal justice system in Illinois. In many ways, these two artifacts, counterfeit and harboring a criminal, these were the two tangible, simple crimes that people could hold on to, which personifies the much larger problem with the Mormon criminal empire. It wasn't bound to the same system of rules that the rest of society adheres to, and therefore it needed to be brought down. But it's amazing to me that people will tolerate criminality until there's a simplistic example or a personification of the much larger problem, which is easily comprehensible, right? Bogus was something the Mormons and the non-Mormon settlements outside of Nauvoo constantly groaned under. But until Jackson was outed as one of the primary bogus makers, nothing was actually done about it beyond just harboring resentment. Joseph Smith chairing his own court hearings and producing witnesses to come to any conclusion in his court, which would benefit him the most, that was a problem that people groaned under. But until Jeremiah Smith was seeking refuge in Nauvoo, the people didn't have a tangible personification of the problem to grasp. But at the highest level of all of it, Joseph Smith was the problem, not Jeremiah Smith or Joseph H. Jackson, right? The criminal empire of Mormonism was the problem, not the ancillary victims or beneficiaries of it. And that gets to a much larger point. As a society, we don't have the tools to put an entire system on trial. Only individuals within that system. We don't have a succinct way of determining the utility or benevolence of a large system with thousands of participants and infinite moving parts. We can only deal with people operating inside of that system. And what's even crazier to me is that the Nauvoo expositor and even Jackson's expose, they discussed polygamy and the horrible, decrepit conditions that women were kept in as sex workers just to serve the highest ranking men of the society. But absolutely nothing was done to solve those problems. Hundreds of victims of a patriarchal system, thousands of instances of rape over years, and all of the criminals who perpetrated those crimes got off scot-free. Look at the church today. It's sitting on a dragon's lair of ill-gotten wealth sucked from millions of people who've been lied to systematically for a century and a half, perpetuating colonialism and racial and religious supremacy, flaunting taxes while exercising a heavy hand in national and worldwide politics, exchanging money with people in hostile foreign countries with absolutely no traceability, and shielding sexual predators for generations, providing opportunities for them to continue their predatory practices, and then harboring these fugitives because, they're just the goodest of guys. He's a real good bishop. I mean, once in a while, an accountant or a bishop is going to be prosecuted with the church's law firm defending them, making a slap on the wrist seems like a great punishment because it's religion, right? But at the end of the day, we don't have any way to put an entire system on trial. We don't have a way of adjudicating whether or not Mormonism is an acceptable organization to keep around or if it should be broken to pieces for constant and flagrant abuses of laws and legal protections that religions get. It's not criminal to run a cult, whether religious or political, and that is one of the greatest trappings of society today. We don't have a way to keep systems like this in control, and brainwashing isn't technically a crime, so we instead make sacrifices of individuals within the system. Right? John D. Lee was executed by firing squad for killing 120 people in a meadow in the Utah Territory. But the system which radicalized him, the people who brainwashed him to believe that in some world it was the right thing to do to kill all those people, they never took the stand. And Lee wasn't even executed until nearly 20 years after the crime was committed because Mormonism shielded him from justice. The guy who was actually responsible for that slaughter has statues in universities bearing his face and name throughout Utah and America. Look, it does no good to attack individuals within a system without putting the system itself on trial. But we as a society haven't yet developed those tools. And I would argue that attacking individuals within a criminal system is actually counterproductive to stopping the abuses committed by that system. Case in point, Joseph Smith was a criminal kingpin and became the victim of vigilante justice when the standard justice system was unable to prosecute him. But Mormonism went on. It went on unfettered and it continued its abuses and in many ways greatly expanded them. The people felt that with the death of Joseph Smith, justice had been served to some degree. And similarly, Joseph H. Jackson may have been one of the primary bogus makers in Nauvoo, but attacking him only caused him to switch sides to antagonizing Mormons, and it forced him into hiding to escape the legal system. Once he fled and dissociated from Mormonism, bogus making continued in his absence, right? Notably as well, in late 1845, when the Nauvoo Charter was revoked and the schism crisis was in full swing, Bloody Brigham Young was about to be arrested for counterfeit money, among other charges, but then resolved that it was time for the Mormons to flee Illinois and go to Mexico. And he quickly set up shop in modern-day Omaha, Nebraska, known as Winter Quarters, and the following year he led hundreds of Mormons into the Great Basin of Mexico, where a new era of genocide and theocracy would kick off unfettered by any system of justice. So, while Joseph Jackson is a personification of it, counterfeit and bogus was just one small criminal aspect of Nauvoo Mormonism. He was only a symptom of the much larger problem, that of a corrupt superstructure which never answered for its crimes. That's going to do it for our main segment today. want to give a huge thanks to Christopher Smith for helping compile the research for Joseph Jackson and counterfeit. It was a bigger topic than I expected it was going to be, so Christopher Smith really chipped in and helped out with the research. So check out Wall Street Petting Zoo or Dreams from My Brain or the Sunstone History podcast if you want to hear more from him, or you can check the show notes for Christopher Smith's Facebook and Twitter profiles, because trying to find a specific Christopher Smith is like trying to find a specific Joseph Smith on the internet that isn't the Mormon Joseph Smith. So check the show notes. You'll find direct links to his profile if you want to get in touch with him. Of course, we do have a new pledge edit on patreon.com/nakedmormonism from our wonderful social media manager, Julie Briscoe, who upped her monthly pledge. So thank you so much for supporting the show for so long, for being our social media guru, and for being one of the longest running fans of the show. Thank you so much, Julie, for that. I deeply appreciate it. Also, listeners on the Patreon exclusive feed, you should have 2 extra episodes in your podcast feed for today. I'm finally caught up on the episodes that I did not get out to you on the previous 2 Mondays, because I give patrons an extra episode every week, reading through our Name a Book Club, or talking about, talking to interesting people, doing our Name a Home evenings, so on and so forth. So if you want to join their ranks, if you want to get access to a whole bunch of extra content, please do so. Patreon.com/nakedmormonism. If not, hey, that's totally cool. You can also help out the show a whole bunch by liking it, by subscribing to the show, or by sharing it through, social media places, or leaving us a 5-star or better review wherever you download your podcasts. So with that, we're going to shut it down for the evening. Thank you all so much for listening to the show, for sticking around to the end of it, and for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved. Did you hear the latest? Oh, dear. What did he do now? He actually tried to extort a president of another country to attack his political opponent. I read the transcript of the call, so what are you going to do about it? Well, he should be impeached. Yeah, but what are you going to do about it? Well, he has to answer for his high crimes and his misdemeanors. Yeah. I agree. He's a criminal. The whole party is corrupt. And this is like one simple thing that we can all grasp and get our brain dead little heads around, right? So what are you going to do about it so he doesn't get us all killed? I'm gonna write an angry tweet and I'm gonna tag him in it. Okay. You're gonna get us all killed.